So let's get started with this interview fireside session on InnerSource for product people. My name is Isabel Drost-Fromm. I'm open source strategist at Europace, and I'm also driving the topic of InnerSource within Europace. Apart from that, I'm also a co-founding director of the InnerSource Commons. And I'm very happy to have Daniel here today with me to answer those questions. Daniel, would you briefly introduce yourself?
Of course, thank you, Isabel. Thank you for this opportunity and the chance to be here. So my name is Daniel Izquierdo. I'm one of the co-founders of Bitergia, a software development analytics company. I'm currently holding the position of CEO. I'm part as well of the governing board at the Chaos Community, which is a working group of the Linux Foundation, stands for Community Health Analytics for Open Source Software, which is where we have a Grimoire Lab, the technology we are developing as open source in Bitergia, and that we use for dashboarding solutions. I'm VP at the InnerSource Commons, and as Isabel, we are sharing good time there at the InnerSource Commons. So thank you.
So I have 3 questions prepared for us today. One question that I have heard from a lot of product people within Europace, but also within other companies is, won't InnerSource, with opening up your team to contributions from others, simply open themselves up to people, throwing stuff over the fence, and then you are left with the maintenance?
So that's a good question. And typically the one of the fears that I see when I talk about InnerSource, either at the InnerSource Commons or with customers of Bitergia, when running InnerSource consultancy, is that, first, I don't know if I want others to touch my code, to modify my code, and second is, maybe I don't have the time to review that thing. And the way I try to discuss this, to bring to context, is that basically people have spent first certain time producing that piece of code, right? And that means that they are giving you as a gift part of their time to make that contribution. Maybe the contribution is not that good as you expected, but the thing is that they spend certain time. So then, indeed, if we go to the roots of all of this, is that perhaps you don't really want others to modify your code. InnerSource is not about letting others to modify your code. We are using, indeed, this concept of zero trust, right? So everyone has read access, but then some of you are the ones that have write access. So that means that you are going to have certain discussions to check what's going on there. All in all, it's basically about having the question on the table is, if you see like a typo somewhere, you are missing an H, would you allow others to make that contribution, at least to say that this is happening? Typically, the answer is yes. So then it's not about not allowing contributions. It's basically about being sure that the contributions that you are going to accept are at the expected quality. So then the thing is, how can we allow people to reach that level of quality? So then this is a work of 2 teams, basically. The team that is making the contribution and the team that is receiving the contribution. So if we are part of a team, let's assume we are working in an agile way. So we are mainly producing documentation for stakeholders, for the final customer. We are having certain iterations and so on. And you know internally how you are working. So you have certain tacit knowledge, right? So you know how you are perhaps using GitFlow, or maybe you are using other ways of developing software. Perhaps you have unit testing. Perhaps you have certain other things. But what happens typically is that all of that information is not explicitly written down somewhere. So in the same way that we have that in open source, when we go to a certain project and we want to install something, we want to try some technology, we follow a contributing file, we follow an install file. That's the type of information that we are expecting if I'm going to a new place and checking if I can make a contribution there. So then the team receiving the contribution should have the house ready for those guests, right? So you need to be sure that you have an install file. You need to be sure that you have a contributing file. You need to be sure that people that are making that contribution understand the level of quality that you are expecting. And that means style guides, requirements documents, and other things. So then the people that are visiting your house, we will be able to say, okay, now I need to follow certain guidelines. So I will read them, and then I'll try to make a proper contribution. And then if that happens, after all, then the discussion will be more fruitful, basically, between both teams. Because then the team making the contribution is not just sending patches over the fence, it's just sending using GitHub terminology, in this case, a pull request. So it's a contribution that needs to be reviewed. And probably the very first thing that the team receiving the contribution needs to do is basically to run unit testing in an automated way. So basically you don't take a pen or a pencil unless the test says everything is okay. So then we have the human beings coming. And what happens in this discussion is that you will have basically people that are interested in contributing, people that are interested in reviewing that contribution, because that's part of the general backlog of the project. There should have been certain previous discussion, of course. And then you have now not only one person or a team knowing what's going on in the code. You have basically two people, the submitter and the reviewer. So basically you indeed have certain knowledge sharing all across the organization. So this is how I see a healthy inner source process in somehow.
You described contributing the documents and readmes. The funny thing that I have seen internally is that sometimes the quality of those documents is very low. Mm-hmm. But then you take people to an InnerSource training and you turn the question around and you ask them, what would you expect going to a project, and what do you need to get started? And the funny thing is that all of the sections that you would teach them, they already know. They only have to change perspective type a little bit. And then you understand, okay, if I want to get started, I need such and such documentation in order to get me going. And then they also quickly realize that, okay, if I want to get started, I need someone to mentor me through my first steps. So it's not like I simply tell someone else, patch is welcome, and then, I have no more work to do. It's just less work because I have to do mentoring, and it likely will decrease over time because the contributing team then builds knowledge and builds skills.
Absolutely. And indeed, with the way the ideal world would be that at some point you have what we call at the InnerSource Commons and InnerSource in general trusted committers, but trusted committers not only from the original project, but trusted committers coming from other business units, because then that means that you've had people that went through a contribution process and then they've reached certain quality level or excellence level developing that software, that they are allowed now to have that right access. And this is the sweet spot, I would say, about InnerSource. It's not only about giving the communication channels or the contribution channels to make that happen, but then to give that career path, so then you can become someone important, let's say, for other business units, because you are now a trusted committer. You have a really deep understanding of the documentation, the technology, the team, requirements, etc. In that specific project, in that business unit.
I think there's 2 points. We have that pattern of governance levels in the InnerSource Commons, and it helps as a host team to understand how far you're willing to go, like if you're willing to give right access, or if you're even willing to give trusted committers a say in your roadmap, and to make that explicit. And it also helps to make that explicit as you go along, because sometimes projects do switch governance levels, like coming from I want to share my code only for reading, and you can send me feature requests, but I don't want to mentor you because I don't have the cycles, towards a place where they are welcome coming to contributions, but they are not yet willing to give out right access, up to the point, where you have shared governance, and making that explicit, in my experience, helps stopping misunderstandings. And the other thing that I've observed is, you quickly touched upon that with trusted committers, you also have like a natural leveling up of people. where senior engineers will spend more time mentoring others and will have more influence in the organization. So you essentially can make that role of a trusted committer pull into, your engineering levels.
Yep. I agree with you. So I was taking note of the sentence. It's about giving a space to developers, right?
Yeah.
So typically, what I've seen is that developers are really constrained by business. Even sometimes they are forced to behave in certain unexpected ways, at least from a development perspective, right? Like, oh, we need this feature coming to the next release for any reason. The thing is that we need to have, let's say, certain technical power on the other side to balance this and say, well, if we keep adding basically patches or new features to the existing project or product, then at some point this will be, maybe a spaghetti code, or maybe certain we are entering into a poorly maintained phase or so. So we need to have a clear and open and frank discussions from a technical perspective and give that token of power to developers as well, because it's about having people discussing with people. It's not about having this hierarchy that sometimes happen in corporations where business, even if business is important, business is driving all the decisions and all the roadmaps and all the technical things. And basically, after all, they leave no room, no oxygen in the room for next steps from a technical perspective. So yeah, it's all about giving a space to developers. Yeah.
I have one more question that we could briefly touch upon. Inner source and open source. Where's the difference, and when do you make the switch? And is there a advantage to having done inner source prior to, participating in the wider open source ecosystem?
Mm-hmm. So my secret being at the InnerSource Commons. So I come from the open source world, and I've been there for several years. And I think this is the right way to proceed. Even if you are a certain size organization, most of your code, it makes sense that this is open source. So let's start from that disclaimer, right? And I think InnerSource is a really good first step to learn how to behave in the open. Using a way of describing this by Johannes, another board member at the InnerSource Commons, he delivered a talk at FOSDEM, and he said, well, InnerSource might be the pool which is close to the ocean, right? And then you can basically play internally, you can try things, you can run new projects, you can try to contribute with others in certain ways, and then once those processes are kind of adopted by the developers, by management, product owners, chief level or so, then it's probably the right time to go out and try open source. So perhaps the main issue with open source, if you are not used to working that way, is that everything is going to be public and going to be open to everyone. So whatever you say, you do, you mention, is going to be there almost forever, right? At least from a technical point of view, from a technological, let's say, environment point of view, forever might be like 10, 20 years, maybe 30. But the thing is, it's going to be there, and that might be scary for some people. So it's about helping people to feel comfortable with that way of working. And InnerSource is a really, really good, very first step into that journey. But what I would love to see happening in corporations at some point is that if you think about open source communities, how they behave, let's imagine there is a release or there is a bug fixing that needs to happen at some point. So if there is a problem, all the community goes into that problem and try to fix it. So basically, the community is flexible enough to move people to do other things that the usual things that they were doing. Maybe it's a translation, maybe it's a release process, maybe it's a bug fixing, or maybe it's something else. But the thing is that people know how to behave, the process, etc., and they simply move. It's like moving people to focus on something. Now, if we move this internally in corporations, basically you have a budget, you have people assigned to this. Maybe you have outsourced people working for other companies, and that's really, really, really hard. I really believe that if we apply InnerSource in an effective way, and if there is a problem in one corner of the company at some point, people should behave in that way, because process and methodologies and tools and all of that is already understood because you've been doing InnerSource for certain time. So then it's about moving people there. And that would be a really, really, really great way for companies to deal with issues sometimes where basically it's not like having just one team of 3 people struggling with a problem and then the rest of the company basically may be on vacation. No, it's about having people helping people to deal with problems. So InnerSource is a very, very good first step to move into that cultural way of doing things. Basically being more communicative, transparent, collaborative. It's about working in a community way.
It's also using the same tools for different purposes. So the way open source projects, for instance, use issue trackers differs vastly from how, say, traditional HR teams use them. And that's a very common source for misunderstanding. Like in what I've heard from some HR coaches is that your issue tracker essentially is, the whiteboard where you move tickets from left to right and where on the tickets you don't have a lot of content. And that's completely different from how people do that in open source. So people moving from a corporate only environment to open source, they will be confused. And something that I've noticed doing open source trainings within my employer is that I kept referring back to InnerSource best practices because they essentially are parallel. It's just that InnerSource isn't Google Open or Google Public, and it isn't archived publicly forever and for everyone to see. But the same principles apply. So some things that I've seen internally is that it makes it easier for people to contribute upstream. So the discussion of being involved in open source suddenly shifts from we want to publish stuff towards we want to help upstream because it helps us as well.
Yeah, basically it's about defining where upstream is. And then maybe upstream is basically public, open. You can Google about this. Or maybe upstream means that this is internally some inner source project or internal project. So yeah, I think that parallelism makes total sense. And when I try to help people into moving into a more inner source way of working, what I do is to bring once and again examples from the open source world and say, well, this is how companies are participating there. So if they are doing this, we can do this internally. Of course, I mean there are certain constraints and so on. I don't know if we think about fintech or banking. So these are highly regulated environments, of course. So then you are telling the regulators, well, our process for managing projects behave in that way, and then we need to use this tool and so on. And then basically you cannot use others because this is what you are telling the regulator. But you can talk to the regulator and say, we are now behaving in a different way. So the thing is about having that documented. It's not that the process says you cannot change this at all. So the thing is that you can change that. It just there is a process to move into that direction. It takes time. But
it's totally worth it. I mean, I'm coming from an open source world as well. So one of my main motivators is to make it easier for people to, participate upstream and to be part of that community.
Yeah, I really believe that if you behave in an inner source way internally in your company, then even if you don't feel comfortable working in the open, it's much easier for you to move into that direction. And even more, if you are a developer that doesn't have any experience in the open source, but you have full experience in inner source, and then you move to another place, it's going to be much easier for you and for the employer to say, well, you know what that means, right? So you know what it means to have a code review process. You know what it means to decide things together, to have public meetings. So it's basically, again, we are bringing to inner source ways of behaving that happen in the open. So now it's the other way around. So you've been behaving internally in certain ways, so now you have to move into the open.
Awesome. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.